A girl arrived in the parking lot of her school to participate in a sporting event and disappeared without a trace. Soon everyone expected a very creepy discovery and the police were called in. It took investigators 28 years to solve this gruesome mystery, and none of them had any idea that this case would be the first of its kind. Sarah Yarborough was born on June 12, 175 in Portland. Soon her parents moved to another state and settled in the town of Federal Way. The town is near Seattle and is basically a suburb of Seattle. Sarah also had two brothers. She helped her parents take care of the younger of the two and was very close to him. From a young age, Sarah was interested in music and ballet. The girl always strived to excel in order to get into a good college. Because of her academic achievements, she flew to New Zealand twice as part of her school program. Later, Sarah joined her school's cheerleading team. She also had many friends. She was a kind person and tried to help anyone in need. On a Saturday morning, December 14, 199, when she was 16, Sarah met her cheerleading team for an event. They were to assemble at the school building, from where a bus would pick them up. The girl took her father's car and drove to school. Only Sarah had got the time wrong. She thought the bus would pick her up at 8 in the morning, although it wasn't actually due to arrive until 9. All her friends arrived one by one, but none of them saw Sarah. Some students saw her car in the parking lot. However, the girl herself was not in it. Even when the bus came to pick up the students, she was nowhere to be seen. Her friends thought this was strange, but no one could contact Sarah because none of them had cell phones at the time. Around the same time, two 12-year-old boys were walking around the school grounds. As they walked through the wooded area behind the school tennis courts, they noticed a strange man. He came out from behind some bushes, looked at them, and walked off in the opposite direction. He seemed strange to the children, but they didn't pay much attention to him and walked on. Just a few meters further on, at the place where the man had come from, a shocking sight awaited them. A girl was lying on the ground with no signs of life. Thinking she was dead, the pupils ran home to inform her parents. While the parents of one boy went with him to the spot, the father of the other decided to follow the suspicious man the children had seen. His son told him that he saw a vehicle that looked like a Chevrolet Nova driving away from the location. Since he lived near the school, the father decided to drive down the street and try to find the car. Eventually, he managed to spot a similar vehicle, but it quickly disappeared from his sight, and the man was unable to find it again. In the meantime, the other boy's parents arrived at the school and realized that the girl on the ground was most likely dead. They immediately ran to the school building and called the police. The officers arrived at the scene and confirmed that the girl was indeed dead. They were also able to quickly identify the deceased as Sarah. Based on the marks on her neck, the police concluded that the victim had most likely been strangled. Next to the body were some clothes, a jacket, underwear, and socks. However, there were no other items near her. The officers found her purse and car keys in the vehicle in the school parking lot. This led them to believe that the perpetrator may have attacked her right next to the car before dragging the body away. The body was handed over to the coroner, and the police began searching for clues. The first thing they did was to try to interview everyone who was on and around the school grounds. The two boys who had found Sarah gave an approximate description of the man who had come out from behind the bushes near her body. According to them, he was a tall man, in his early 20s, with shoulder-length blonde hair. He was wearing a dark coat and black trousers. The police soon managed to find another witness. A rather surprising story awaited them here. A man who was out jogging noticed a strange sight in the same wooded area. A girl was lying next to a bush and a man was hovering over her. The girl did not move, and the witness thought that a couple had just decided to have some privacy. A few minutes later, he walked down the same street in the opposite direction, and the man and girl were still there. On both occasions, he did not have the impression that he was observing the commission of a serious crime. The witness himself explained this to the police officers by saying that he had only recently immigrated to the United States from a different culture, and did not know what behavior was common in this country. Nevertheless, the witness gave police a rough description of the killer that matched the words of the children who found the body. Investigators interviewed several dozen other people who were in the vicinity of the school, but no other useful leads emerged. Meanwhile, medical experts examined Zara's body and concluded that the cause of death was strangulation. Apparently, the perpetrator had used her own tights. A serious injury to the girl's head was also found. The experts assumed that the victim had lost consciousness as a result of this blow. This was consistent with the statement of the runner, who had seen that the girl lying on the ground was not moving at all. The forensic experts examined Zara's clothes and found traces of male semen on almost all of them, which came from the same person. However, in the Year of the Dead there was no DNA database, so investigators could only rely on a direct comparison of DNA samples from specific suspects. The investigators noticed another nuance. Although forensic experts found traces of male semen on Zara's clothing, medical experts said there was no evidence of sexual assault on her body. With all this information, investigators formed their own picture of what had happened. Zara arrived at the school nearly an hour early, and there wasn't a soul in the parking lot. Her attacker had probably discovered her there. He waited until the girl got out of the car and hit her on the head with an object, causing Zara to lose consciousness. He then dragged her out of the parking lot behind some trees, where her body was later found. The perpetrator removed some of her clothes and performed lewd acts on her before strangling the victim with her own stockings. When one of the children who found Zara's body told the police officers about the car in which the suspected perpetrator had fled the scene, the investigators searched for a Chevrolet Nova. And they soon found what they were looking for, but they were in for a disappointment. It turned out that the driver of the vehicle was delivering donuts that morning. He gave his DNA sample, which did not match the one found on Zara's clothes. Apparently, the children had just seen the vehicle driving down the street next to them and thought the perpetrator was at the wheel. In fact, none of the boys could remember exactly whether they had seen a man coming out of the bushes towards a car. Over the next few days, the police continued to search for witnesses and new clues. On Monday, school resumed, although all the pupils were horrified by what had happened. Not only was the murder only a few meters away from their school, but the perpetrator was still at large, and his identity unknown. The girls were afraid to walk the grounds alone. Therefore, the boys from the sports teams agreed to accompany each student to her car or bus so as not to leave her alone on the street. Investigators determined that there were about 70 potential witnesses in and around the school that morning. They spoke to each and every one of them. However, no new information could be obtained. Based on the statements of the two children and the jogger, A sketch of the murderer was created and sent to all local newspapers and television stations. The media reported extensively on the case, and in the following weeks the police received hundreds of tips. The investigators followed up every single one, but in all cases they hit a dead end. Once they received a tip about a man who matched the description of the murderer and who already had a criminal record. However, the investigators were disappointed. His DNA did not match that of the perpetrator. Since then, the case has received no helpful leads for many months. In total, the police received around 4,000 different tips, and they tried to process every single one of them. But the resources of the local police were simply not enough to cope with this amount of information. Moreover, time was playing against them. Even as the investigators continued to search for the perpetrator, there were new cases every month that required their attention. When Sarah's family learned that the police didn't have enough resources to process all the leads, her grandfather tried to help where he could. He worked for a technology company and convinced management to temporarily provide the police with a very powerful computer worth $150,000. In the 90s, that was an enormous sum, but the management agreed. With this computer, police officers were able to store the information on all the leads in one place, process them faster, and compile them conveniently for quick review. Still, every lead led to a dead end, and she made no progress in the years that followed. 2 years later, Sarah's classmates graduated, and before graduation, they decided to memorialize their friend. They raised a considerable sum of money and spent it on erecting a memorial. It consisted of a bench on which Sarah's belongings, which were made of metal, were placed. Next to these items was a picture of the girl's dog reaching for her handbag. In the years that followed, the case was regularly reopened. All available evidence was re-examined, but the result was the same. They were still no closer to the perpetrator. During this time, the police interviewed several thousand people and took DNA samples from almost 300 possible suspects, but none of this yielded any results. 2011, 20 years after the murder, a new detective decided to enlist the help of modern technology. He learned that a company was active in the field of genetic genealogy. The police officer contacted them and asked if they could try to locate the relatives of the person who had left their DNA on the victim's body. The experts took on this task. Unfortunately, they were unsuccessful. Firstly, genetic genealogy had only just begun in the year 2011, and the experts were very limited in what they could do. For example, they had not yet learned how to search for male and female relatives from a single DNA sample. If they had male DNA to hand, they could only search for male relatives and vice versa. Secondly, they faced another obstacle in the form of various laws that prohibited the use of data samples to search for relatives of suspects.
Nonetheless, this produced some interesting results.
Firstly, the research group that the detective had approached had already been working for several years to create a genetic family tree of the first people to sail from Britain to the USA on the Mayflower ship in the year 1620. When they examined the DNA of Sarah's murderer, they discovered that this man was related to one of the ship's passengers, Robert Fuller. However, it was almost impossible to find him through this chain, especially in those years. There were just over 100 people on the ship, but over the centuries the number of their descendants has exceeded 25 million people. Secondly, the detective had no idea that he had made the Sarah Yarborough case the first of its kind. Although his idea had failed, it was the first crime to be solved using genetic genealogy. The detective tried to use the information available and located several men with the surname Fuller who were living in the area of his town at the time of Sarah's murder. He found their photos and met with the only witnesses, a jogger and two men who had found the body when they were children. Unfortunately, none of them recognized the killer in the photo. Finally, the investigator requested DNA samples from all the Fullers in the area and sent them to the lab. However, none of them turned out to be the killer. This is where something interesting happened. The experts found out that one of these men was actually a distant descendant of Robert Fuller from that very ship. However, he was definitely not the murderer, nor was he known to have any distant relatives nearby. It is possible that the killer was so distantly related to him that the families were unaware of the connection. In the years of the murderer's life, the detective retired and the case was handed over to a new team. The investigators contacted the company again, who requested a DNA sample from the murderer. Assumed. By this time, the possibilities for examining the genetic material were already well advanced, and the experts agreed to try to determine the criminal's parentage. It took 2 years. The experts used publicly available databases to find even the most distant relatives of the murderer. They then manually tried to trace their family connections and locate people who lived in the Federal's Way area during the years of Sarah's death. In total, they had to search several thousand people before they finally found what they were looking for. The experts determined that a DNA sample from Sarah's clothing most likely belonged to one of the two brothers. At the time of the murder, one was 33 and the other 27 years old. The older one turned out to be a criminal with an impressive criminal past. He had been in prison for violent offenses, and his DNA sample was on the FBI database. That meant he had nothing to do with Sarah's murder, because if that were the case, his DNA would have been a match in the 90s. As for the younger brother named Patrick Nicholas, he too had come under police scrutiny several times for violent crimes, including against minors. However, this was before DNA samples from such criminals were added to the database. The investigators immediately organized surveillance of the man. The man, who was already 55 years old at the time, lived in a neighboring town called Wellington. The police followed his every move for 2 days and soon had a good opportunity. Patrick went to the laundromat, and while waiting for his clothes to be washed, he went out for a smoke and threw the cigarette butt on the floor. One of the police officers immediately picked it up in a bag and returned to the car. Patrick went out a second time to smoke a cigarette, and this time a handkerchief fell out of his pocket. The man did not pick it up and returned to the laundry room. The police were happy to be able to take the second piece of evidence with them. In case the experts were unable to obtain a DNA sample from the cigarette butt. However, the experts were easily able to take samples from all these items, and the next day they gave the detective the long-awaited news. Patrick's DNA matched perfectly with the semen found on Sarah's clothing. A judge immediately issued a warrant for the man's arrest, and the police took him into custody. It took only 5 days from the time investigators learned his name until he was formally charged with murder. When his biography was leaked to the media, many people asked themselves the perfectly logical question: why was a man with such a criminal past not even considered as a suspect in all those 28 years? At the age of 19, Patrick Nicholas approached a young girl and got into her car, where he attempted to abuse her. The victim managed to run out and escape, but she had to jump into a river and swim for a long time until she was a safe distance from the perpetrator. Patrick spent 4 years in prison before he was released. The next offense in which he was caught by the police was in 1994, when he attempted to abuse an underage girl. He was arrested again, but the offender's DNA was not stored in any database. The reason for this was very strange. The paragraph after he was prosecuted was not strict enough to collect DNA and include it in the database. Despite this, the police had never come across his name in 3 decades. Nor did he appear among the 4,000 tips that had been received over the years. It also turned out why the genetic genealogy experts were unable to trace him back through the line of Robert Fuller. It turned out that Patrick's biological grandfather was adopted, and he grew up under the surname of his adoptive family. One of the men who discovered Sarah's body as a child in the year 1991 immediately declared that Patrick was undoubtedly the murderer. He confessed that the incident had made a deep impression on him. He was only 12 years old at the time the body was discovered, and the killer had seen his face. For years, the witness was constantly afraid that the murderer might be after him. And it was only when Patrick was arrested that he finally felt safe. The trial against Patrick only began at 2023. The man insisted on his innocence, and his lawyer tried to challenge the main piece of evidence, the DNA. In his opinion, the presence of Patrick's semen on the murdered girl's clothing did not prove his guilt. However, this argument did not work. The lawyer also tried to question the accuracy of the DNA analysis itself. However, the experts explained that such claims were absolutely untenable. Ultimately, Patrick was found guilty of first-degree premeditated murder. On May 25th, he was sentenced to 45 years and 8 months in prison, making it virtually impossible for him to ever be released. At the sentencing, Patrick showed no emotion, unlike Sarah's relatives. They also addressed the judge and thanked all those involved in the trial and the researchers for bringing the murderer to justice, although he had been able to evade justice for 28 years. Uh... 17-year-old girl left the cafe where she worked part-time at weekends and disappeared without a trace. The police began to find disturbing evidence that led them to believe something really bad had happened to the girl. From the first days, the case became a major news topic in Sweden, and more than 1,000 people joined the search, making it the largest in the country's history. When the sad truth came to light, people were shocked at how such a thing could happen. Lisa Holm was born on February 7, 1998, in the small Swedish town of Skövde. It was a quiet and peaceful place. She lived there with her parents and her older sister. Lisa was a friendly, positive, and determined person. Even before she finished school, she decided to move to Australia to train as an architect. In addition, she and her parents traveled often and saw many other countries. The girl was also very independent. Even as a teenager, she tried to take various part-time jobs to earn her own money. Before the summer of 2015, when Lisa was 17, she got her first real job in a cafe about 40 minutes away from her home. For the first few weeks, her parents took her there by car, but soon her father bought her a scooter. Lisa had a driver's license for this, as she couldn't get a car license until she was 18. The girl was delighted with this gift, as she wanted to drive to work independently. Nevertheless, her father accompanied her for a few weeks, as Lisa had virtually no experience of driving in traffic. She only worked at weekends, and her father drove with her every morning and evening. It wasn't until the 7th of June that the girl rode her scooter to the cafe on her own for the first time. Around noon, her parents decided to drive to her workplace to get something to eat and check on their daughter. The cafe was very busy that day, and Lisa was pressed for time. She took a short lunch break, had a snack with her parents, and they drove home. At 18:23, Lisa texted her father that she was going home now. But just 3 minutes later, he received a call from her phone. The man picked up the receiver, but no one answered. He heard some voices in the background and thought that Lisa had pressed the call by mistake. It seemed to the father that his daughter was talking to her colleagues. He also heard a car door being slammed. The man said her name a few more times before ending the call and waiting for her to come home. An hour had passed since then, and the girl's parents were beginning to worry. Lisa should have been home by now. Her father immediately thought that something might have happened to her on the way there. It was the first time she had ridden the scooter alone, and the man was very worried about her safety. He tried to call her several times, but Lisa's phone was switched off. After waiting a few more minutes, the father decided to drive out to meet her. The girl had to take the shortest route, and the man hoped to meet her on the way. The father feared that his daughter might have had an accident, so he drove at low speed and looked around the road. But Lisa was nowhere to be found. The man reached the cafe without finding his daughter. As he approached her place of work, he saw Lisa's scooter parked in front of the building. At this point, the man panicked as he couldn't find his daughter the whole way. When he saw her scooter, he immediately calmed down. The father thought that the girl had been held up at work for some reason. However, there was no one at the business, and the man noticed something else. The keys to the scooter were in the ignition, and Lisa's helmet wasn't on either. This finally gave him the idea that something bad must have happened to the girl. She would never have left the keys in the scooter and left it unattended in a parking lot. In the meantime, Lisa's mother called the owner of the cafe in the hope that she could shed some light on the girl's disappearance. But the woman claimed she had no idea where she could have gone. At around 6 o'clock in the evening, she called her employees, who told her that they were closing the cafe. After Lisa's mother called, the cafe owner immediately got into her car and drove there. On the way, she called her friends who lived near the cafe and asked them to help her search. 4 people complied with this request. When the cafe owner arrived on the scene, she and the girl's father began to comb both the restaurant itself and the surrounding area. Their last hope was that for some reason Lisa had decided to take the bus home rather than the scooter. They asked about the timetable, and the girl's mother and older sister went to the bus stop in their town. Unfortunately, this version was not confirmed. Lisa was not on the bus. The family immediately contacted the police. At this point, it was almost 10 o'clock in the evening, and it was getting dark outside. The police immediately began a manhunt. The fact that the girl's scooter had been left in the parking lot with the key made them suspect that the girl might have been abducted. Such cases are quite rare in Sweden, and even rarer in this remote provincial region. So the officers immediately sent several teams with dogs to search for her, and other police officers began searching every house in the area. Soon her classmates and friends learned of Lisa's disappearance. They spread the information about her disappearance on social media in the hope of finding witnesses. The search for the girl continued throughout the night. However, they yielded no results. On Monday morning, police announced that Lisa was missing and appealed for anyone with useful information to come forward. Around the same time, officers were approached by a man who had discovered a motorcycle glove in a barn directly opposite the cafe on his way to work. The police had searched the barn on the evening of the girl's disappearance but had not noticed the glove there. It was shown to Lisa's parents and they confirmed that the glove really belonged to her. This strengthened the abduction theory and the police provided additional resources for the search. In the meantime, news of the girl's disappearance had spread through the neighborhood, and hundreds of volunteers joined the search. On Tuesday, police received several more disturbing tips. Volunteers searching the area along a country road that begins just a few hundred yards from the cafe found a cell phone case, a receipt, a ticket, and a smashed smartphone screen. Investigators immediately determined that all of these items belonged to Lisa and focused their search in this area. They soon found more pieces of the smashed smartphone, Lisa's ID, and several more receipts. All of these items were scattered along the same highway. After discovering this evidence, the police had little doubt that Lisa had been the victim of an abduction. They used all available resources to search for her, and every day more and more concerned people joined in. The case became a big issue all over Sweden, and hundreds of volunteers traveled from all over the country to join the search. A volunteer organization that specializes in searching for missing persons also took part, making it the largest search operation in the country's history. In total, more than 1,000 people took part in the search. The police also received numerous calls with possible leads. One woman said she had gone jogging the day before Lisa disappeared. She was stopped in the middle of the street by a man standing next to his car. He spoke to her in English and asked her for directions to a town she had never heard of. She showed him the direction on Google Maps. But then the man asked her to get into his car and show him the route on his sat-nav. Naturally, the woman viewed such a request with great suspicion and refused, whereupon she continued on her way. In her conversation with the police, she noticed an interesting detail. She thought she had seen the man before among the workers carrying out repairs in the bar opposite the cafe. Lisa's colleagues also said something interesting. On the day of the disappearance, one of the waitresses noticed two men standing across the street from the cafe, looking in the direction of the bar. She didn't think much of it, but after Lisa's disappearance, she decided to report her observation to the police. The next morning, a Wednesday, the girl's father and his friends combed the country road where her belongings had been found. After walking a little further, he discovered more disturbing finds. Lisa's scooter license and her house keys. It all looked as if Lisa had been driven down this street in the direction away from the cafe, and the kidnapper had dumped her belongings there. Police officers and volunteers made every effort to search the area further, but no other items were found. That evening, a friend of Lisa's father drove past the cafe on his way home from the search. He noticed that the police tape on the barn where the girl's glove had been found had been removed. The man decided to go inside and take a flashlight with him as it was already dark outside. He walked around the room for a few minutes until something shiny on the floor caught his attention. As he got closer, he saw a woman's earring and a second earring nearby. The man informed the police, who showed the earrings to Lisa's parents. They confirmed that the jewelry belonged to their daughter. The police cordoned off the barn again and searched it more thoroughly. The lead investigator later said that on the first day of the search for Lisa, they focused on finding the girl herself, and therefore only examined the barn superficially. As a result, they might have missed small items such as earrings. This time, however, many forensic experts were called in. During the second search, they noticed a very unusual piece of evidence. Behind one of the partitions, the police found human feces. At first glance, you might think that this has nothing to do with the case. However, criminologists have a reasonable explanation. They say that criminals produce a large amount of adrenaline when committing serious crimes, so they often feel the need to defecate. For example, it is common for a murderer to wet themselves before or during the crime. Since Lisa's glove and earrings were found in the barn, it was clear to the police that if she had indeed been abducted, the perpetrator had dragged her into this very room. The investigators therefore did not rule out the possibility that the person could not hold back under the influence of adrenaline and had defecated, and the feces were handed over to experts for DNA analysis. On Friday, the search area was extended, and the volunteers reached a farm about 3 kilometers from the cafe. It was a complex with several large buildings where many people worked, and the members of the search team decided to look at all the buildings. However, as soon as they arrived at the site, they were approached by 2 men. They couldn't speak Swedish and only spoke English. One of them said that the police had already inspected the yard. However, the leader of the search party had doubts about this information. He was of the opinion that he would have known about it in this case, and ordered the search to continue. The 2 men walked around the property for a while, observing the volunteers before leaving again. About an hour later, members of the search party found a pile of branches behind the barn, under which they found a motorcycle helmet, a jacket, and headphones. Police officers immediately arrived at the scene and confirmed that all of these items belonged to Lisa. They sent forensics officers to the yard to search it more thoroughly, and also listened to the story of 2 strange men who tried to stop the volunteers from looking around the yard. The police recalled the report of a woman who had encountered a suspicious man who spoke English. They also already had an idea of who it was. During the first days of the search, all the houses near the cafe were searched, and in one of the houses lived 2 brothers from Lithuania and the wife of one of them. All 3 could not speak Swedish and communicated in English. They were the only people within a radius of several kilometers who did not speak the local language. The police had other clues that made them appear suspicious. The brothers worked in the barn opposite the cafe and on the farm where Lisa's helmet had been found. They were very familiar with these buildings and the surrounding area, and the country road where many of the girls' belongings were found led to their house. As the police had no other suspects, they decided to question her for the time being. They set off to take her to the police station. Forensics officers arrived at the farm along with volunteers. They continued to look around the farm. An old caravan caught their attention. It was surrounded by tall grass and looked as if it had not been used for years. Near the door, however, the planting was crumpled, as if something had recently been lying there. Also, some of the grass had been pinched by the door. This meant that someone had recently opened it. When the forensic technicians opened the door, they were immediately struck by a strong corpse odor. Inside the trailer were lockers for clothes. Apparently it had previously been used as a changing room for the workers. These lockers, except for one, were locked. And the experts thought that Lisa's body was in one of these lockers. They began to open them one by one, but quickly realized that the girl's body was in the open locker. Behind a pile of old clothes and rags, the murderer managed to place his victim despite the small size of the locker. There was a rope around Lisa's neck and a large amount of tape on her head. Her pants were down and her t-shirt was pulled up. The coroners determined that Lisa died by strangulation. They found no signs of abuse. All her clothes were handed over to the expert. Meanwhile, news of the discovery of the body spread across the country. All week, the news of the abduction of a 17-year-old girl was the most important news in Sweden. And when her body was found and the public learned that Lisa had been brutally murdered, the case went viral. Crimes of this kind were extremely rare in Sweden, and people were shocked that someone could commit such an atrocity. On the same day that the girl's body was found, something unusual and very eerie happened. YouTube users found a video that had been posted 13 days before the murder. The title of the video was the number 13, and the video itself was a timer counting down. The most disturbing thing was the name of the channel that published the video. It was Lisa Holm. The information about this video immediately went viral, and many people were shocked by such a series of coincidences. Some believed that a user had predicted the murder. In reality, however, everything turned out to be much simpler. Apparently, someone simply changed the name of the channel and the video already after the discovery of the girl's body. Either this person wanted to start another conspiracy theory or just make a cruel joke. In the meantime, the police were tasked with finding the murderer as quickly as possible. At the time of Lisa's discovery, investigators had already brought 2 brothers and a woman to the police station, and all 3 denied involvement. They claimed to have been at home at the time of the abduction and confirmed each other's alibis. According to them, the older brother was asleep in his room. His wife was cooking dinner while the youngest brother was sitting at the computer. The older brother, named Nereus, added that he woke up around 8 in the evening and went to a gas station where he bought cigarettes. The police did not believe the alibis because all 3 could protect each other. They took DNA samples from them, but investigators still didn't have a single piece of evidence linking them to the murder. But it didn't take long. Forensic investigators worked in the barn and on the farm, using all available means and forces, and it didn't take long for it to pay off. There was something like a small office cubicle in the barn opposite the cafe. It had a large window that looked directly out onto the cafe. Upon examining this room, the experts found 15 different traces of male semen on the walls and floor of this window. It looked as if a man had been standing there watching the female employees of the cafe, including Lisa, and pleasuring himself. These sperm samples were immediately sent to the laboratory, where a DNA profile was created in a very short time. These 15 sperm traces completely matched the DNA of the older brother, 35-year-old Nereus. The same applies to the feces found in the barn. They also belonged to him. In the room next to the office, where cow's milk used to be stored, the forensic experts discovered a pipe. It protruded about 2 meters from the floor and was covered with a thick layer of dust except for a narrow strip. The size of this strip matched the rope wrapped around Lisa's neck. Traces of blood were also found on the pipe. A DNA analysis showed that it belonged to Nereus. A piece of exactly the same rope was also found on the floor under the pipe. Forensic technicians examined it and identified 2 DNA profiles, that of Lisa and that of Nereus. This was the first serious lead for the police. The man had definitely interacted with the rope that had killed the girl. Lisa's hair, among other things, was found on the floor of this room. Another important piece of evidence came from her jacket, on which traces of Nereus's DNA were also found. Based on the available evidence, the police came to the conclusion that she had been killed here. They formed an approximate picture of what had happened. In their opinion, Nereus had been watching the cafe for some time, and when Lisa was alone in the parking lot, he drove up to her in his car. According to the woman, the man may have asked Lisa to show him the way to a certain town, whereupon Nereus may have asked her to get into his car to enter the directions. Since Lisa was a good-natured and helpful person, she could have agreed. Once the girl was in the car, the perpetrator taped her mouth shut and drove to the barn across the street. There he put a rope around the girl's neck and hung her from the pipe. According to experts, this sight aroused the man so much that he vomited on the ground from sheer adrenaline. He then put Lisa's body in the car and drove to the farm. On the way there, he threw her belongings out of the window and hid the body in a locker in the trailer, covering it with old clothes lying around. All this took the perpetrator less than an hour from the time of the abduction. Despite all the available evidence, Nereus continued to insist on his innocence. His wife and younger brother had to be released as there was no evidence against them. After they were released, they left Sweden almost immediately and returned to Lithuania. The preparations for the trial were very intensive. Nereus said that he had worked in this barn for a long time and that his DNA could have ended up there. He also had alibis from his wife and brother. Although these two sources were highly questionable, this would definitely work in his favor in court. On the other hand, the presence of Nereus's DNA on the victim's clothing could only be explained by the fact that he had touched her directly. The police also found witnesses who had seen his car near the cafe shortly before and after Lisa's abduction. According to them, the car had driven along the road between the cafe and the farm several times, at the exact time when Nereus was allegedly sleeping in his house. In the months following the discovery of the body, experts continued to examine the evidence using state-of-the-art laboratories. Eventually, they were able to find traces of Nereus's DNA on almost all of Lisa's clothes, including the inside of her underwear. While the whole country was watching the case, investigators continued to search for other useful evidence that could affect the trial. They even traveled to Lithuania to speak again with the suspect's wife and brother. The wife kept insisting that he had not left the house between 6 and 8 in the evening. But when it was the younger brother's turn, the police suddenly got what they wanted. After the man was presented with all the evidence against his brother and told in detail what he had done to the 17-year-old girl, the man decided to confess to everything. He stated that Nereus was actually not at home that night and only returned at 8:30. He had been very dirty and had immediately thrown all his clothes into the washing machine. When the police began to search all the residents and reached their house, Nereus whispered to his brother, "Tell them I was at home at the time." He later explained this as follows. Nereus feared that he would be blamed for someone else's crime because he was an immigrant and had no alibi for the time of the kidnapping. The younger brother truly believed that his brother had nothing to do with the murder. But after looking at all the evidence, he realized he was wrong. Lisa's funeral didn't take place until a month after her murder. The church where it was held only had room for 130 people. However, there were many more people who wanted to say goodbye to the girl. The organizers decided to set up benches and large screens outside so that everyone could watch the ceremony. The trial began 4 months after the murder. The case had attracted the attention of the whole of Sweden, so everyone involved was under great pressure. None of them had the right to make a mistake. Nereus's lawyer insisted that his client's DNA could have gotten on the victim's clothes because he worked in the barn. The prosecution, on the other hand, pointed out that this theory made no sense, especially in the case of Lisa's underwear. The only way the suspect's DNA could have gotten there was if he had touched the victim's underwear. There were not many other plausible excuses to be heard from Nereus. His lawyer merely tried to theorize that the real killer was the younger brother, who had taken several DNA samples from Nereus and placed them on the victim's body and at the crime scene. However, he was unable to explain the physical possibility of such DNA manipulation. The trial ended after 1 month and Nereus was found guilty of murder. The man was sentenced to life imprisonment in a maximum security prison, which is more like a nice 3-star hotel. His lawyer tried to appeal against the sentence, but the appeal was rejected. At the beginning of November, Nereus himself applied for his deportation and transfer to a prison in his home country. The reasons for this decision are not known. Lithuanian prisons are very different from Swedish prisons, and for the worse. However, the court decided to approve his application. After all, it costs Swedish taxpayers several $100s a day per offender to provide comfortable prison conditions. Later that year, his intentions became apparent. He appealed to a Lithuanian court, and his sentence was reduced from life to 15 years. However, the murderer's joy was short-lived. A few weeks later, the Court of Appeal overturned the sentence. Nereus was again forced to spend the rest of his life in prison, only now he had no chance of returning to the comfort of his Swedish cell. 5 years later, in August Nereus was confronted with another disadvantage of the Lithuanian prison. While the prisoners were being transferred to another building, one of them attacked the man with a knife. Nereus suffered severe cuts and died on the way to hospital. As for his wife, her involvement is still not completely ruled out. Police have stated that the woman's direct involvement in the kidnapping or murder has been virtually ruled out, as experts would have to find her DNA on Lisa's clothes or objects. However, it cannot be ruled out that she knew about her husband's crime and helped him escape justice by giving a false alibi. Nereus's younger brother also raises questions. The employees of the cafe testified that they had seen 2 men standing outside the barn watching them. Since one of them was most likely Nereus himself, the second must have been his brother. However, the man's DNA was not found in the barn itself or on Lisa's clothing. This makes his involvement in the murder unlikely. Perhaps he and his older brother watched the young female employees and even discussed some lewd things. But only Nereus dared to commit such atrocities. The girl left the hotel and disappeared without a trace. She had to take a straight road from the city center. When the police started searching for her, however, she seemed to have vanished from the face of the earth. Many disturbing discoveries, unexpected twists, and extremely bizarre events awaited her. For several years, the case remained one of the most perplexing disappearances, but eventually the unexpected truth came to light. Britney Drexel was born on October 7, 191 in the American city of Rochester, in the state of New York. The girl's parents separated when she was very young. Soon after, her mother married another man named Chad, who adopted Britney. The couple later had another daughter, Marilla. Due to Chad's military service, they had to move frequently. After he left the service, the family settled in a Rochester suburb called Chili's. Britney was diagnosed with a rare right eye condition at an early age. The girl had to undergo a series of complicated operations. However, the doctors were unable to correct the problem. As a result, the eye stopped seeing, and later Britney began wearing contact lenses to hide the defect. Despite this, the girl lived a full and happy life. She had many friends. She loved spending time outdoors and playing sports. During her school years, she fell in love with soccer and joined the local women's team. Britney was so taken with the sport that she achieved excellent results in a short space of time. The girl also had big plans for her future. She decided to become a nurse, beautician, or model. When Britney was 16, her parents divorced. This event hit her hard, as it did her younger sister. Nevertheless, the girl tried to maintain a positive attitude. She also continued to communicate with her father and saw him regularly. A year later, in April of that year, Britney wanted to spend spring break with her friends in the seaside resort of Myrtle Beach in South Carolina. Her mother, however, was very opposed to the idea. The girl was only 17, and the town was more than 1,000 kilometers away from her home. All her friends were also teenagers, and none of the adults wanted to accompany her on this trip. In addition, the mother immediately had a bad feeling about this trip. She had the feeling that her daughter would be in great danger. In the end, the woman forbade her to go there, which upset Britney greatly. She and her mother argued and practically didn't speak to each other for several days. On April 22nd, the girl told her that she wanted to go to a friend who owned a house on the shore of a local lake. Britney wanted to spend a few days there to rest and get her thoughts in order. Her mom didn't mind since the lake was close to her town, and she let her go. In fact, Britney decided to go to Myrtle Beach with her friends without telling her mother. She honestly felt that her mother was overestimating the potential risks and that nothing bad would happen to her. She met up with her friends that same. On April 25th, she called her mother again and said that she wanted to return home the next day around 8 o'clock in the evening. The girl decided to walk to the hotel where her old friend from Rochta was staying. It was about 2.5 kilometers away from her on a straight road on the first shoreline. Almost immediately after the girl got there, one of her friends texted her. Earlier, Britney had asked her to borrow some pants. That night, however, the friend demanded that she return them because she wanted to wear them herself. Britney was unhappy about having to walk the whole distance again, as she was already wearing the pants. Nevertheless, she left the friend's hotel and made her way to her hotel. On the way, the girl texted her boyfriend John. He had planned to go on this trip with them, but he couldn't take time off from his part-time job. Britney told him she had to walk back to the hotel and complained about her friend. At some point, the girl suddenly stopped answering. That seemed strange to John. He sent her a few messages and wondered what was going on, but she didn't reply. The man then tried to call her, but Britney didn't answer the phone. So the boy called her friends. They said that she still hadn't come and wasn't responding to their messages either. John texted the girl a few more times. He thought about how she was just ignoring him for some reason. He said that he would tell her mother if she didn't answer him. But even after that, Britney didn't get in touch, and John realized that something bad might have happened to her. So he decided to call her mother and tell her what was going on. The woman was shocked by the fact that her daughter had gone there without permission. She immediately called the local police and reported the disappearance. She later traveled to Myrtle Beach. Her ex-husband also followed her to help search for the girl. Myrtle Beach police officers did not begin their search until the next morning. After speaking with Britney's friends, they learned that the girl had left her hotel room around 8 o'clock in the evening. At 8:30, she was caught on camera in the hotel where she was staying. At 8:48, Britney was caught on camera again. This time she left her friend's hotel. The police tried to find more cameras on the way to her hotel. However, they were unsuccessful. Investigators also spoke to the friend the girl had been visiting. The young man stated that he and his buddies were watching a baseball game at the time, and Britney did not join them. Toward the end of the game, just 15 minutes later, she said she had to go back to her hotel because her friend demanded that she return her pants. The friend added that he offered her a ride in his car because it was already dark outside. However, the girl decided to walk. Police concluded that the men most likely had nothing to do with her disappearance. Surveillance footage showed Britney leaving the hotel alone, but none of the men followed her. Investigators looked at the girl's room and realized that almost all of her belongings were in place. Only her handbag and her phone had been taken from the hotel during the night. This indicated that it was unlikely that Britney had run away on her own. This was contradicted by the correspondence she had with her boyfriend a few minutes before she disappeared. Britney told him that she was going home the next morning. The girl added that she had no plans after returning to the hotel and just wanted to go to bed. The police officers tried to reconstruct the chronology of events that evening. Britney left the boyfriend's hotel at 8:48, and the last message to John was sent at 9:15. It turned out that the girl had almost reached the hotel and had disappeared just a few minutes before the hotel. The police also found a street surveillance camera just a few hundred meters from her hotel. They looked at the footage, but Britney was not on it. This means that she disappeared on the way to this camera. The investigators requested data from her cell phone provider about the girl's disconnections from the cell towers. To their surprise, they found that the phone was on until the wee hours of the morning, and the last time it was on was about 90 kilometers from Myrtle Beach, just off Highway 17. This was a red flag for the police officers. The area where Britney's cell phone was last seen was covered by swamps where many alligators roamed. Investigators feared that the girl may have been abducted and killed before her body was dumped in one of these swamps. The police launched a search operation in the area, using helicopters, quad bikes, and dogs. However, they were unable to find any trace of the missing girl. 11 days later, the search was called off as investigators realized that if the girl was in the area, she would have no chance of survival after all this time. In the meantime, police officers continued to search for clues in Myrtle Beach. They were all at the hotel at the time of her disappearance, texting her and trying to call her. The police concluded that it was unlikely that they had anything to do with the case and no longer considered them as suspects. In addition, investigators spoke to another friend of Britney's whom she had met the day before she disappeared. The man initially struck them as odd. However, there were no indications that he had anything to do with it. Moreover, he came to the police station himself as soon as he heard that the girl was missing. Consequently, he was not considered a suspect. In the weeks that followed, the case was widely reported in the media. The police released surveillance footage and hoped for the public's help. And Britney's parents appeared regularly on television, including on major TV shows. Later, the case was featured in a prominent program about disappearances. All this led to a number of clues, but none of them brought the investigators any closer to the girl. At one point, they decided to check out all the men living in Myrtle Beach with violent felony convictions. This process took quite a while, but a dead end awaited them here. The main problem was that the police had absolutely no evidence. Therefore, it was almost impossible to find the possible perpetrator. In December of the same year, 8 months after the disappearance of Britney, the investigators unexpectedly received a new lead. A tourist couple staying in a tent near Georgetown found a woman's glasses and handed them over to the police. The police discovered that the glasses belonged to Britney. However, no traces of foreign DNA were found on the glasses. A few months have passed since then. Britney's mother moved closer to Myrtle Beach to follow the search. She also theorized that her daughter may have been abducted by a criminal gang and then taken to another country. However, investigators deemed this unlikely. In June of the following year, the case was given another chance to be solved. A 20-year-old girl was walking down a street in Myrtle Beach when a van stopped in front of her. 2 men got out of the van and tried to grab her. However, the girl was able to fight back. She punched one of the men and fled, whereupon she immediately called the police. The investigators were able to quickly arrest one of the attackers. He was 37-year-old Timothy Taylor. Given the similarity of the events to Britney's disappearance, he immediately began looking for involvement. For 5 months, the police tried to link him to the case. Eventually, however, they concluded that he was most likely not involved. In the years that followed, the police followed up a few more leads. They searched the home of a possible suspect and also combed the area of the island near the river, following a tip-off from a fisherman. But none of this led to any results. In the year of May, the police found a skeleton near the spot where Britney's cell phone had last turned up. They already suspected that the remains belonged to the girl. However, this version was not confirmed. The skeleton was male. In the year of May, the FBI stated that they did not believe that Britney was still alive. In their opinion, she was abducted and taken to the place where her phone signal was recorded and then killed. The FBI also offered a reward of $10,000 for clues that would help solve the case. A few months later, the case took a very unexpected turn. Remember the man named Timothy Taylor who had tried to kidnap a 20-year-old girl in 2010? To the investigators' surprise, their new suspect was his son, 26-year-old Dashan. The FBI informant, who was serving time in a South Carolina prison, told an interesting story that happened to him before he cooperated with authorities. According to him, on April 27, 2009, he came to a cabin in the woods where his acquaintances involved in various illegal activities were gathered. The man was to hand over money to Timothy Taylor. However, an eerie sight awaited him in the house. In one of the rooms he saw Dashan, accompanied by 11 other people, being violent towards a girl. Before his eyes, the girl managed to free herself and run to the door. However, Dashan drew his gun and pushed her back. After the informant went into another room, he heard 2 shots. He later saw a wrapped body being carried out of the house. When the man returned home later, he saw a news report about Britney's disappearance and realized it was the same girl. To the investigators' surprise, this account was corroborated by the testimony of another informant. He revealed that Dashon had actually abducted Britney and taken her to the house where he abused her. According to the informant, the perpetrator planned to sell her to one of his friends, but when the case became public, Dashon was afraid of being caught and killed her. Both accounts matched the investigators' version of events. According to the informants, the girl was killed 2 days after the abduction, and Dashon's father's house was in the exact area where Britney's phone was last recorded. However, the police had a problem. There was a lack of evidence. The statements of their informants would not be enough for a conviction, especially when you consider that the two are serious criminals. The investigators then decided to arrest Dashon on other charges, as he had often been involved in the robbery of Mech while driving a car that year. While fleeing the scene, they drove to another state, making it a federal crime. However, in those years, the man was only convicted in his state, which the FBI took advantage of. They arrested Dashon in hopes of getting information from him about Britney's disappearance. His lawyer tried to challenge the decision, as the man had already been convicted of the robbery. But the FBI took the case to court anyway. They also questioned the man about the kidnapping case, but he said he had nothing to do with it. In the summer off, Dashon agreed to a polygraph interview because he had been promised a lighter sentence for the robbery in return. During this interrogation, the polygrapher recorded 2 answers that seemed false to him. Dashon was asked if he had seen Britney since her disappearance and if he had anything to do with the case. In both cases, the man answered in the negative, but the examiner did not believe him. However, the polygraph results could not play a role in the trial either, and the investigators had nothing to go on. Dashon's trial ended in July off. Saint and he was sentenced to just under a year in prison for his role in the robbery. While the investigators were thinking about how they could prove his guilt, something else unexpected happened. In February, the first informant gave an interview in which he suddenly changed his story. He now claimed that he had seen Britney 4 times since her disappearance, and that the girl had been killed a month after her disappearance. This was allegedly done by a man named Nate. This story puzzled and perplexed the investigators. They tried to track down this Nate. However, they were unable to find such a man. In the years that followed, police officers continued to investigate. They tried to find evidence against Dashon, but they also explored other possibilities. In the first few weeks after Britney's disappearance, investigators went through all the men who had been convicted of violent offenses. At the time, they had made a list of the most interesting suspects, and 10 years later they decided to revisit it. One man was at the top of that list, Raymond Moody. There was no evidence against him. However, the police took into account his previous offenses. Moody had spent 20 years in prison for abusing 7 girls younger than him. The youngest victim was 5 years old and the oldest 17. Despite this, Raymond had 3 children of his own. After the divorce, he began a new relationship. Raymond was the man whose home Tweethousendelf was searched in the Britney case. However, no evidence was found. 2021, the FBI team decided to try again to find out if the man had anything to do with the kidnapping. This time they chose a different route. Raymond had a girlfriend with whom he had been dating for over a decade. When the man was interviewed in the first weeks after Britney's disappearance, he stated that he had not been in Myrtle Beach that weekend. However, FBI agents found out that this was a lie. On April 26th, the day after the girl's disappearance, he was pulled over by a highway patrolman who issued him a speeding ticket. In addition, his girlfriend confirmed that she had been with him in Myrtle Beach on those days. Not only did this invalidate his alibi, but it also suggested that Raymond had deliberately lied to the police officers. Another interesting point was that the police officers had already questioned his girlfriend in 2011. At that time, she said she did not rule out Raymond's involvement in the kidnapping given his previous offenses. She was questioned again in April 2022. When the woman was asked questions about the day of Britney's disappearance, she began acting strangely and tried to leave. However, the investigators persuaded her to return. The woman then said that the day after Britney disappeared, Raymond came home with scratches on his face, the origin of which he never explained. As for the day of the disappearance itself, the woman stated that Raymond asked to change cars for a while. He took her large pickup truck and gave her his passenger car. At this point, an interesting twist awaited the investigators. After her story, they decided to track the movement data of her phone that very evening. Thanks to modern technology, they succeeded. It turned out that the woman's cell phone was located near the place where Britney was allegedly abducted. She also used a credit card near this location on the same evening. Based on this information, investigators came to the disturbing conclusion that the woman may have been in the car with Raymond when he abducted Britney. When questioned, she denied this theory. The woman stated that she had left her phone and bank card in the car. She also added that Raymond left the house that evening and returned half an hour later without explaining his behavior. Investigators asked the woman to try to talk to Raymond and even suggested she wear a microphone. However, she refused. After this conversation, the investigators monitored the woman's apartment for several days. They noticed that Raymond was behaving very strangely. He kept leaving the house, looking for something in the car, and was visibly nervous. The investigators then obtained a search warrant for his home, where they confiscated several phones and other items of interest. But none of it gave them the evidence they wanted to use in court. The investigators realized they were close to solving the case and decided to make an interesting move. Using the woman's phone and credit card details, they wanted to arrest her on suspicion of aiding and abetting the kidnapping. And this decision brought them a welcome result. They called Raymond in for questioning and told him that they were going to arrest his girlfriend. Within minutes, the man suddenly declared that she had nothing to do with it and that he had killed Britney alone. He then told investigators his version of events, which immediately raised doubts. According to Raymond, he was driving down the road that night with his girlfriend, smoking weed, and saw Britney. She approached his car of her own accord, said she wanted to smoke too, and then got into the vehicle. They then allegedly drove toward Georgetown to the riverfront. Raymond said his girlfriend left them for a while, and he tried to make intimate contact with Britney, but she resisted, whereupon Raymond abused and strangled her. He then hid the body as his girlfriend was due to return at any moment. When she arrived and asked where Britney was, Raymond said her friends had come to pick her up. That same night, the man returned to the river and buried her body. This version seemed extremely dubious to the investigators. In their opinion, Raymond had twisted the story, and it was not what had really happened. It was more likely that the man abducted Britney from an empty street and took her to the river, where he abused and killed her. This version was also supported by the fact that the girl suddenly stopped responding to the man's messages. Even when the young man threatened to tell her mother the truth, she did not react. As Raymond had said. The investigators realized that the story had been constructed in such a way that the woman could not be punished for her complicity. But their main concern was Raymond himself. The fact that he had tracked down the location of the victim's funeral proved his guilt. And after 13 years, the man could finally be punished. At the trial, he did not change his statement and pleaded guilty. The trial was therefore concluded in a short time. On October 19, 2022, Raymond was sentenced to 30 years in prison. At the time the sentence was passed, he was 62 years old. It was therefore unlikely that he would ever be released. In his last words, the man explained that he was a real monster and that he was sorry for the suffering he had caused the girl. In this way, it was finally possible to put an end to this complicated story. Nevertheless, there are still some points that give the investigators pause for thought. For example, they still cannot say exactly why two of their informants made false statements against Dashan. However, both people were criminals with a criminal past. Therefore, their statements were initially viewed with great skepticism. It was possible that they were using the information to frame Dashan. In return, they were to receive a reduced sentence for their help in the investigation. There is another matter that the investigators are looking into. They suspect that Raymond was involved in the disappearance of a 28-year-old woman in the year 2005. He lived near her at the time, and the investigators believe he may have abducted her. However, Raymond denies this, and there is no evidence against him. It is therefore very likely that he will not be additionally charged. A 24-year-old woman disappeared from the store where she worked the evening shift. Police found traces of blood in the back room and signs of a struggle. But it was definitely not a robbery. The unknown perpetrator left behind a cash box full of money. A few days later, the woman's body was found 5 kilometers from the store, and the investigation into this gruesome case dragged on for 25 years. It was only after a quarter of a century that it became known what had happened to Lisa. Lisa Maria Seagert was born on March 24, 1968, in the American town of Holyoke, Massachusetts. She grew up in a friendly family with 3 other children besides herself. They lived in a town called Agawam. The girl fell in love with music at an early age and learned to play several instruments. She was even a member of the school band for a while. After high school, Lisa attended Westfield State University, where she graduated with a teaching degree in 1990.
During her internship, she worked several shifts as an educator at a children's camp and also taught Sunday school at her church.
She then took a job as a teacher's assistant at Agawam High School, where she had once been a student. She spent most of her time working with a group of children with special needs. Lisa got along well with the students. At 24 years old, she understood them better than the other teachers. At the same time, she was highly professional and tried to ensure that each of her students received the best possible education. In the evenings, she worked part-time in a local card and gift store. On Wednesday, April 15th of the year 1992, she finished her shift at school around 5:30 and went to the store, where she had to work until 9 in the evening. At about 6:30, her sister Lynn came in to work briefly. According to her recollection, Lisa was in a good mood that evening and nothing indicated any problems. The next morning, sales assistant Sophia Maynard came into the store to start her shift at 9 o'clock. To her surprise, Lisa's car was in the parking lot. That was strange because she worked at school in the morning and shouldn't have been in the store. There was a light on in the room and a sign on the door saying open. Sophia suspected that Lisa had taken over the morning shift because Easter was approaching. They were planning to blow up balloons and sell them for the festival. Sophia entered the store and called Lisa's name, but she received no answer. As she approached the counter, she saw her belongings there, including her wallet and car keys. It all seemed very strange to her colleague, and she decided to call the police. The officers arrived at the store and began to search the store. Everything looked normal in the main part of the store, but a sinister discovery awaited them in the back room. The police officers noticed several broken boxes with traces of blood. Later, they found some cards scattered on the floor that also had traces of blood. They also discovered a small dent in the door, which they assumed could have been caused by a punch. Nevertheless, they were unable to find any useful traces in the store. It soon emerged that Lisa had not turned up at school that morning either. The principal even called her mother to find out if everything was all right. But the mother didn't know where her daughter was either. The news of Lisa's disappearance spread quickly through the small town, and within a few hours all her friends, relatives, and acquaintances were informed about the case. The police initially suspected a robbery, but this theory was immediately rejected. No one had touched the money in the till or Lisa's purse, and all the goods were in their places. The investigators began to reconstruct the chronology of events that evening. They learned that Lisa's sister had left the store at around 6 in the evening. They obtained further information from conversations with employees of neighboring stores. At around 7:20, Lisa spoke to the owner of the carpet store next door. They talked about an urgent problem with the local parking lot, which was occupied by customers from the bowling alley. The owner told her that he wouldn't risk voicing his displeasure with the drivers who parked in front of his store, because many of them were crazy and dangerous. They talked for about 15 minutes, then he went home. When the police checked the till, they found that the last money had been received shortly after 8 o'clock in the evening. Investigators also found a woman who entered the store at about 9 o'clock and 5 minutes. The door was open, but the clerk did not come out. The woman thought she heard noises coming from the back room, but then decided to just leave. This is how the police established the approximate time window for Lisa's disappearance. She served her last customer at 8:20, and at 9 o'clock something had already happened to her. The investigators had to find out what had happened in those 40 minutes. The local investigators were assisted by the FBI and the state police. Together they organized a large-scale manhunt. Foot patrols combed the area around the store, and several helicopters searched the more remote area. Police dogs were also brought to the store in the hope that they could pick up Lisa's trail. Unfortunately, none of this led to any results. The investigators realized that Lisa had obviously left the store involuntarily, and so on April 17th, the local police chief announced that the case had been reclassified. While it had previously been a missing persons case, 2 days after her disappearance, the police were already investigating an abduction. On Sunday morning, April 19th, all the local churches prayed that Lisa would be found alive and unharmed. It was Easter, but there was no holiday spirit. Around 14 o'clock in the afternoon, the police received a call. A man was walking his dog on the outskirts of the city, not far from the 75 freeway. As he was walking along a wooded area, he noticed the body of a woman and immediately called the police. The police officers arriving at the scene identified Lisa Seagert. Several wounds caused by a sharp object were found on her body. Medical experts later determined that the woman had also been the victim of abuse. Her body was found about 5 kilometers away from the store. This means that the perpetrator had probably driven her there in a vehicle. The investigators immediately cordoned off the area and drove through it in a single line so as not to jeopardize any possible evidence. It had been raining these days, and several wheel tracks could be seen on the sodden dirt road. Unfortunately, the police were unable to find the weapons or any other clear evidence. The news that Lisa had been the victim of an unknown brutal murderer spread quickly through the town. The farewell service was held in the church where Lisa Seagert taught on Sundays. It was attended by almost 1,000 people. The inhabitants of the small town, who were used to a quiet and safe life, were thrown into a state of panic. Many shopkeepers canceled individual shifts, and employees escorted each other to their cars. Self-defense classes were overcrowded within a few days. In addition, about 300 women applied for permits to own firearms. The whole city feared that an unknown criminal might strike again. In the meantime, the police and the FBI worked almost around the clock on the case. It soon became known that they had managed to find a DNA sample at the crime scene that could belong to the murderer. They theorized that Lisa's boyfriend was involved. However, he had an alibi and his DNA did not match the sample found. The girl's friends, colleagues, and relatives were also DNA tested. There were no matches here either. The police also received many tips from local residents. Some reported that they had seen a suspicious car on the night of Lisa's murder. Others claimed to know the name of the perpetrator. However, all these clues led nowhere and were sorted out by the investigators. Based on the tire tracks on the road near where the body was found, the police determined that they had been left by a van or a large SUV. The investigators questioned all the drivers of similar vehicles and once again were unable to get any closer to the perpetrator. However, they did manage to find a witness who may have seen the same vehicle. An employee of a store near Lisa's workplace was on her way home at around 1:20 in the evening. As she stood at a traffic light, she saw a large SUV turn off the road and drive towards the spot where Lisa's body was later found. The woman could not describe the vehicle as it was dark outside. She only said that she believed there was a man and a woman in the vehicle. She added a very curious fact. As the car drove down the gravel road, the woman's head jerked in an unnatural way. It was as if she was asleep or unconscious. Unfortunately, even this information did not lead to a suspect. Since then, there have been no further leads. The police continued to work on the case, but with each passing month, the hope of solving this gruesome mystery dwindled. A year and a half passed before Lisa's family and friends were given another chance to find out the truth. In October of the year off, national television aired an episode dedicated to Lisa's case. The popular program featured stories about unsolved cases that attracted a lot of attention. Sometimes new witnesses would come forward to the police and the case would get a second boost. Lisa's case was no exception. Within an hour of the broadcast, the police received several hundred calls from people who could provide information. As usual, most of these tips came to nothing, but the police followed up on every single one. According to the investigators, they were able to filter out a few valuable tips from the mass of calls, but they did not specify them. Unfortunately, this also came to nothing. As the years went by, the chances of solving the case dwindled. Lisa's family worked hard to ensure that her legacy was not forgotten. Although her career as a teacher ended early, Lisa's relatives made an important contribution to the education system in Agawam. In the year of her time, her parents donated $11,000 to the science department of the school where Lisa worked. These funds were used to purchase equipment and support genetics classes. Her parents also set up a fund to support gifted students, from which prizes worth about $10. Years had passed since Lisa's murder. Her mother had never given up hope that the case would ever be solved. She tried very hard to keep the memory of her daughter alive. Her mother attended every interview and answered questions from reporters, and every year she gathered hundreds of people to honor Lisa's memory and light candles. In the meantime, the police had only one important piece of evidence in their hands: a DNA sample from the suspected murderer. They repeatedly checked it against databases of known criminals in the hope that the person they were looking for would turn up sooner or later. But year after year, nothing happened. In September of the year of Lisa's murder, the investigators decided to try out a new method: DNA phenotyping. It essentially works as follows. Using the information contained in a person's DNA, specialists determine the characteristics of their appearance and create a supposed portrait. Currently, experts can use DNA to determine a person's gender, approximate age, skin, eyes, and hair color. The portrait created on the basis of this data is not always accurate, but sometimes the match with the face of a real person is simply amazing. Based on the DNA of Lisa's suspected murderer, experts created 2 portraits of the suspect at the ages of and 50. When the police released these portraits, they received over 170 calls. These people reported that they had seen a similar person, but most of these leads also led nowhere. It wasn't until a year later, on September 18, 2017, that the police suddenly made a big announcement. The perpetrator had been arrested. It was a 49-year-old man named Gary Shara. The news immediately spread through the American media. It is very rare for the police to find a murderer after a quarter of a century. Therefore, such stories immediately attract a lot of public attention. Immediately after Shara's arrest, the investigators reported how they had managed to catch him. It turned out that the man was already considered a suspect in the year 1993, i.e., 1 year after Lisa's murder. Do you remember the program on national television after which the police received hundreds of calls with possible clues? One of the callers was an attorney from Seattle. He told investigators that his client might have information about Lisa's murder. This was a woman who was in the process of dissolving her marriage to her husband. They lived in a town called Longmeadow, which is near Agawam. According to the woman, her husband was very attentive to the Lisa Seagert case. When the murder was on TV, he would walk into the room and stare at the screen, completely oblivious to those around him. As you might have guessed, this man was Gary Shara. He was 24 years old at the time. He was in a very unhappy marriage and had a 1-year-old son. He and his wife were constantly arguing and had filed for divorce shortly after the birth of their child. According to police, the version of Gary's involvement was investigated as early as 1993, but not confirmed. On the contrary, his ex-wife, who served as a source of information, left all doubts. The fact is that she had a whole range of mental disorders and a long history of alcohol abuse. In addition, Gary was awarded custody of their son during the divorce, but his wife secretly took the child to another state. Another important fact to mention here: it was not the first time that former or current wives called the police and said that their husbands might be involved in Lisa's murder. Surprisingly, there were actually many such calls, so the investigators thought Gary's case was just one of them. Nevertheless, they questioned him, but the man denied involvement and refused to give a DNA sample. Legally, no one could force him to give a sample. So the police basically had no other option. Later, investigators compiled a list of all the men who had been questioned in the case and who had refused to give a DNA sample. Gary was among them, and the police summoned him for questioning several more times. At the third interview in the year, it was often obvious that Gary was trying not to touch anything, not even the table. He was offered a bottle of water, but he refused. It looked like he had only one thing on his mind: to prevent the police from getting his DNA sample. By the year, often investigators had a list of 11 suspects, including Gary. All had been questioned at various stages of the investigation and had refused to voluntarily submit to DNA testing. In fact, there were many more suspects on this list, but thanks to DNA phenotyping, the investigators were able to weed out unsuitable candidates. They did not match any of the characteristics that the experts had identified from the DNA sample of Lisa's murderer. In August of the same year, the investigators brought together all the available information and went to court. They applied for an order requiring everyone on the list to provide DNA samples, and the court agreed. On September 13th of the same year, the police went to Gary's home to inform him of this obligation. However, the man was not at home. The door was opened by his roommate with whom he shared an apartment. The police left him their business card and asked him to pass the information on to Gary urgently. The very next day, something unexpected happened. Gary's current girlfriend came to the police station and reported that he had left 3 letters in her apartment. To the investigators' surprise, they included an apology to the Seagert family and a detailed 2-page confession to Lisa's murder. Gary wrote that he had developed violent and uncontrollable desires since childhood. He was obsessed with thoughts of abduction and abuse. That evening, as he drove past Lisa, Gary allowed himself to do something terrible, as he put it in the letter itself. The man made it clear that he did not intend to kill Lisa, but events were allegedly getting out of hand. Gary wrote that he wanted to turn himself into the police hundreds of times but couldn't do it out of cowardice. He explained that he had lived with self-hatred all these years. At the end of the letter, he explained that he was planning to take his own life. The police immediately set out to find Gary, and soon his car was spotted in a hospital parking lot in the town of Stafford Springs. There was another suicide note on the windshield. It turned out that the man had been taking powerful drugs, but immediately afterwards he got into his car and drove to a nearby hospital where he was pumped full of medication. As soon as the doctors had helped him, the police arrested Gary and took him to the police station. At the same time, the judge issued a search warrant for his apartment and his girlfriend's apartment. There, the police confiscated several items containing his DNA. The result of the analysis surprised no one: a complete match with the murderer's sample. The investigators also came across several other potentially important clues. Gary's wife, who had already raised suspicions about him in the Year of the Dead, died in the Year of the Dead. However, the investigators managed to find documents written by her lawyer in which the woman revealed many gruesome details. One day Gary told her in plain language that he could only be intimate with her with a knife in his hand. The day after Lisa's murder, the woman called her sister and told her that Gary had come home late at night, was extremely agitated, and his body was covered in scratches. He also gave his wife a music box and said that he had bought it in the store where Lisa worked. According to Gary's own testimony, however, it was sold to him by an older woman with gray hair. The problem is that this employee was never there. It's unclear why all these details were not given to the police in Year of the Dead, and it's impossible to find out now. In custody, Gary suddenly declared his innocence and refused to confess to his actions. He was probably driven by the usual fear, but with such evidence there was no chance of getting away with it. The only thing he could achieve was a pardon. The trial was not due to start until 2 years later, but Gary, who had been sitting in a cell the whole time, suddenly decided to confess. On September 24th of the Year of the Dead, he appeared before the judge and pleaded guilty to the murder of Lisa Seagert. The charge was first-degree murder, and in Massachusetts such a conviction is punishable by life in prison without parole. Lisa's family was present in the courtroom. Her mother, who had hoped for 25 years to learn the truth, took the floor. She thanked everyone involved in the investigation and also the people who had supported her family all this time. The result was that the murderer will spend the rest of his life behind bars. One of the state's longest-running criminal cases was officially closed. Regardless of the fact that it took a quarter of a century, the bitter truth in a case like this is always better than endless ignorance.